Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, the host of the podcast, and I'm so delighted to introduce the people joining me today. We have Dave, who is on the podcast with me periodically,
hey,
and
everyone.
a special guest today, Dr. Craig Blomberg. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
We're so glad you're here. Help our listeners get to know you a little bit. So whatever you would like to share that will give us a small introduction to your life, Craig.
I am partially retired from having taught full-time for 35 years in the New Testament department at Denver Seminary, but I still teach part-time and do a lot of other things. Native of Western Illinois. Did college and seminary in Illinois and met my wife in a pre-internet world, and we went on a 3-year honeymoon called graduate school to Aberdeen, Scotland. Got my
Is
first.
that how she would describe it?
No.
Okay.
Not in the least. It's not how I would describe it if I were being serious. And got my first teaching job. We're 3 years in South Florida at Palm Beach Atlantic, but we've been in Denver since 1986. And I like to say I have one wife and 2 daughters and 3 grandchildren. And who knows what the next generation will bring, but I probably won't live to see it because we started having kids not until we were in our 30s, and my daughter, who has our 3 grandchildren, did the same thing. Love to follow Denver sports teams, but my lifelong dream came true in terms of sports fanaticism when the Chicago Cubs won the World Series in 2016. Never thought I'd live to see it.
Our very own Michael Goldstein, who is also from Illinois, I think really appreciates that the two of you share this, share a love for the
He's
Chicago
a good man.
Cubs.
Well, Craig, you and I met years ago. Our relationship began with just a cold email. I was a final year student at Dallas Theological, and I don't know if you remember this or not, but a couple of things were kind of happening in my world at this time. An opportunity for me and my wife to go on a multi-year honeymoon for grad school in England. We were looking at that, but we were also meeting with a good friend who is another student, Hunter Beaumont, and praying about doing a church plant in Denver. And I was a New Testament major in seminary, and so knew who you were professionally, but also knew you were in Denver, and you were the name on the cover of several books I owned, but that was about it. And I found your email online and just emailed you out of the blue. Questions about grad school, questions about the historical Jesus, which we'll get to in a little bit, and also questions about Denver. And I emailed it out, not really expecting a response. The next day, you responded to my cold email out of nowhere with such kindness and clarity about your experience in Denver. You gave me connections of people who were doing church planting in Denver, as well as thoughts about Tyndale House, which is where I was going to go, in Cambridge, which you have a long history with. And I just, after reading that, thought, man, this is a really gracious man of God. And who takes the time to respond to an email like that? Well, turns out Craig Blomberg does. And anyway, from then on, you've been a kind of when we did graduate school, would continue to reach out. And when we moved to Denver, we met several times, and you helped me with the finalization of my PhD, and read it I needed a good reader, and so I gave it to you, and you gave it a professional, critical review. I still remember some of the things you said that were needed and helpful, and then also when I got my PhD, you hired me to teach some of your courses. So in terms of my personal relationship, and then your relationship with Fellowship Denver, you were we featured you in some of our very earliest open forums on the historical Jesus as we were getting Fellowship Denver started. You were so generous with your time, and you've been a friend of Fellowship from the very beginning. You and Fran, I remember, came to one of our first, if not our first service, a few of our very first services, and I'm sure you were traumatized by that experience, but you were always, both of you were always just so friendly to us and such a support. So it's a real joy to have you on the podcast today.
Well, you made it very easy. If everybody I met was as talented and passionate and committed and friendly, I'd never get any work done. I'd just be meeting people and going to church.
I think, Dave, you mentioned also that you and Dr. Blomberg, you and Craig co-hosted a forum at CSU at some point in your earlier days in Denver.
That's right. I don't know who organized it. It wasn't me. I'm sure it wasn't you. But at some point, we got roped into doing this event. And I remember a lot of your current students who, at least a couple of whom now, are elders at Fellowship Denver. They were involved with it. And that was the first time I ever heard you lecture on John. You had a number of questions, and I forget the exact format, but you talked about the historical reliability of the Gospel of John and how do we read it historically. So I remember kind of flagging that in my mind, and but yeah, we've done some work together over the years.
Hope it's not the last time.
I hope not either.
Yeah, it was an interesting connection as Dave was reflecting on how long he's known you and how you so graciously responded to him reaching out to you and Fran years ago. And then he said, "Oh, we co-hosted this forum and I heard Craig speak on the Gospel of John. And we specifically wanted to invite you on to talk about a book that you recently authored that is on the Gospel of John." And so it was a fun connection for Dave to make as he was thinking back of all of the ways that his time and your time in Denver have overlapped. And so we are so grateful that you're willing to just spend some time with us today. This particular podcast episode is one of a few in which we're interviewing some friends of ours in the greater Denver metro area who are authors. And so we wanted to have you on to talk about one of your books. You have authored many, though. How many books do you have that have been published at this point?
If you count those that I've done with other people as well, and a few that I edited, I think we're up to about 30.
30. And this one, though, I've read maybe half of those 30. This feels like a bit of a magnum opus. It feels like a definitive work. Now, I want you to talk about it. I don't want to give too much of my summary thoughts on it, but this is a special book.
I was very flattered and surprised that Christianity Today gave it its Book of the Year award for 2023 in the area of biblical studies. So it was a long time in coming. People asked me to do other things. This was something I wanted to do. I kept postponing it, but I'm glad it came out as well as it did.
So, Craig, maybe let's give some background just for our listeners. This book isn't just on the Gospel of John.
Right.
It's really incorporating a lot of important work on John into a broader multi, a 300-year sort of long so-called quest for the historical Jesus. And in fact, the first half of the book is really giving context for this academic pursuit that sort of bubbled up from sort of the result of the Enlightenment. And so maybe for our readers who might wonder, even when you hear the term the historical Jesus, they might wonder what that even means. Well, doesn't the Gospels give us the historical Jesus? And that's the only Jesus I need, or I want to know about. Maybe help kind of frame up the discussion, the long kind of history of this particular academic sort of quest.
The name itself comes from a landmark book that many people, especially my generation, baby boomers and older, heard of by a German man by the name of Albert Schweitzer, who wrote a book that was translated into many languages and into English in the very beginning of the 20th century. I remember as a kid, and it had to have been before I turned 10, crunching the numbers, watching on my parents' black and white television, this elderly gentleman with shocks of white hair going in every direction before punk had ever been invented, who in the 50s won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in West Africa as a medical missionary. He really was a man of many talents. He had a PhD in New Testament studies. He had a PhD in psychiatry. He was a concert organist, and he had set for himself the goal to figure out what he wanted to do with his life with all these talents by the time he turned 30, and then he was going to spend the rest of his life doing it. And that's exactly what he did. Went off to Africa. But he wrote a book, the title of which in English translation is The Quest of the Historical Jesus. And starting in the late 1700s, he surveyed just a huge amount of literature of people who did not begin with the church's historic commitment to the four Gospels, nothing but the Gospels, everything in the Gospels, as what we might today call the database for what we know about Jesus. But a whole cottage industry had developed and flourished of people saying, if I simply function as a historian, if I don't make any presuppositions for or against Christian faith, what can I know about Jesus? And some of the people that did this were quite radical and came up with some very disturbing conclusions. They at times ran afoul of church authorities. And so if you like, not quite a murder mystery, but if you like a lively adventure story, there's some amazing personal vignettes in the middle of this whole account. But one thing that was consistent was because the Gospel of John seems so different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, everybody focused on Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the so-called synoptic Gospels, and John got short shrift. And in most cases, people said, well, John is too different for us to trust him if we're going to believe that it's the first three Gospels from which we get most of our reliable information, however much we think can be validated or authenticated. That quest, and some people divide it up into separate quests. Others would talk about different phases of the quest. But that area of interest within biblical scholarship has continued right to the present with all kinds of fascinating results. So I wanted to set what I was doing in context, and then say, but what do we do with John? Do we have to write him off? No, I don't think so. And oh, by the way, in the last 20, 25 years, there has been what a few people are actually calling the fourth phase, or the fourth quest. They've defined what they think the other three phases are. And its defining feature is to treat John much more seriously as a historical document, to varying degrees. But that's something I wanted to build on, and then that shifts into the second half of the book.
Well, when I was introduced to this quest for the historical Jesus, when I was in seminary, it was in the meat of what some would call the third quest for the historical Jesus, which is reading Jesus and appreciating the Jewish backgrounds of his culture and literature. And we have the benefit of, there's a lot of literature out there. There's a lot of Second Temple Jewish material out there that you can read and sort of familiarize yourself with, that then provide a really helpful grid. Then you can read the Gospels through and create some meaning and some historical rootedness and some connection to the people who were living in that part of the world at that time, and the people who were sort of leading the charge in that quest. People were like Tom Wright and Darrell Bach, who was at Dallas Seminary when I was there, and those were the people who I was reading, who I was interested in, and I remember thinking, and I remember actually specific lines in particular books that just dismissed John out of hand. John's there. In fact, I remember Tom Wright saying this in person and in print, but the first time in person, saying that the Gospel of John is a lot like my wife. I love her to death, but can't understand her. Now, I remember thinking he's going to be in a lot of trouble for saying that. But it struck me like your point. Most people think that John is so radically different that it hasn't been a reliable place to go in order to build a portrait of the historical Jesus, using all the tools that are available to do that sort of thing.
Let's break that down, I think, for the people listening a little bit more. What is it, aside from the fact that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are more similar, what is it about John that makes it so distinct, that would cause it to be questioned in the way that you're describing?
Somewhat over 80% of the verses, stories, accounts in John are not paralleled anywhere else. It's only in John that you have an account of Jesus as an adult ministering both in the north and the south of Israel, both in Galilee and Judea and in Samaria in between, before he embarks on the major public phase of his ministry that the synoptics talk about in detail. It's only in John that we learned that his ministry must have lasted more than a few months because of all the times he's going up to Jerusalem at a festival time, and this takes a period of 3+ years. It's only in John where you have the 7 famous I am sayings. I am the bread of life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I'm the good shepherd. I'm the gate for the sheep, and so on. It's only in John where you have John himself making statements like in the first 18 verses, the prologue or preface to his gospel, where he begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That is such a clear and explicit equation of Jesus with deity. You don't find anybody saying that explicitly anyplace else. And then bracketing that at the other end of the gospel in the resurrection account, when Thomas is finally present and he sees Jesus, he sees for himself, and he calls out, "My Lord and my God." And so those, and then just maybe the greatest miracle of all, the resurrection of Lazarus, maybe the strangest miracle of all, turning water into wine, and so many details. It's like, well, I think the average evangelical Christian, when they become familiar with John, that becomes their go-to gospel. And their problem is, how do I fit Matthew, Mark, and Luke into this? Whereas those who now for, as Dave said, well over 200 years have either broken from the church or at least set themselves the exercise of not starting from Christian presuppositions, would say, well, I got a lot more reason for thinking what I see, especially common to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as being the solid core bedrock historical Jesus. Now, what do I do with John?
What was it that compelled you to see something different, I think, in John, or within the academic field of historical Jesus studies, to be compelled to say, no, there is something that overall John contributes that we're missing if we don't put effort into applying the same sort of academic expertise?
It goes right back to my college years, when I was part of a chapter of what in those days was called Campus Crusade for Christ. Now they've boiled it down to a syllable and called it CRU. I, among other things, was a religion major in a college that was a private school, so there wasn't the problem of separation of church and state, but it was a school that, as I would describe it, was pretty rapidly and intentionally moving away from its religious roots. But a lot of well-educated people there, professors included, and I would talk to somebody about Jesus and mention something out of the Gospel of John, and it seemed like half the time, even students would say, well, you can't trust John. Modern scholars know that if you're going to talk about Jesus, you got to go to the other three Gospels. They might not be able to say much more than that, but they knew that much, or thought they knew that much. And so the whole question of what do you do with John has been something that I've been interested in. I had the opportunity very early in my career to write a book on the historical reliability of the Gospels more generally. Had one chapter on John, but I knew that didn't do it justice. About 15 years later, I had the chance to write an entire book just on the reliability of John, but didn't do anything with putting it into a bigger framework of what others were saying about Jesus or how it fit with the Synoptic Gospels. And so this was something I'd been wanting to do for some time, but as I'm sure all our listeners know, life gets in the way of some things you'd like to do.
Mm-hmm. So then, at what point did the transition in thinking happen where, okay, I have this experience, I have this expertise with this gospel. I also am conversant in historical Jesus type of work. When did the seed for this book Get Planted, which, by the way, I don't know if we've even mentioned the title
The full
of the book.
title.
The full
Yeah.
title is Jesus the Purifier, John's Gospel and the Fourth Quest for the Historical Jesus. When did the seed for this book get planted? And at what point did you begin to think, okay, there needs to be another phase in the quest for the historical Jesus? Part of the history of these quests is that they do kind of peter out, like they kind of lose
Right.
energy after a while, and everyone thinks everything that could be written has been
Right.
written and rewritten, and publishers begin to sort of quiet down. At what point were you like, no, actually, there's a lot here, and in fact, we need to like redirect our energy into this pathway?
I wish I could give you the date that God gave me the revelation that all this was supposed to happen, but it didn't unfold that way. I remember a book that came out in 1985 called The Priority of John that was published posthumously by a man who had been a bishop in the Church of England in Cambridge, better known for his radical views and more skeptical approach to traditional Christianity during the 60s and 70s. John A.T. Robinson. A lot of British people have two middle names, so then you get two initials. And it was fascinating, and hardly anybody paid any attention to it. There were a spate of articles in academic journals, some of them tucked away in multi-author works of different kinds that were talking about a new look on John. That was sort of the phrase that was used at the end of the 20th century. But in 2002, a man who has taught at George Fox University for many, many years now, Paul Anderson, got approval to start a new seminar at the Society of Biblical Literature, which is the giant academic association that meets annually of people who teach biblical studies from any perspective, not just from a Christian or a theological perspective. And the name of the seminar was called John, Jesus, and History. And there would have been plenty of people in the guild that would have said, how do you put those three words together? John, Jesus, and history. And slowly, with presentations, many of which were edited and collected, and eventually 3 big academic volumes, also called John, Jesus, and History, were published by the Society of Biblical Literature, all to one degree or another, some much more so than others, arguing that there was something, maybe one passage, maybe a theme, maybe a stylistic feature, but there was something in John worth taking more seriously historically than had been before. And it was interesting watching these people, and Anderson himself has published many books and articles, moving from, is it time to start talking about a fourth quest? To then in the 2010s, starting to say, actually, it looks like a fourth quest has begun. So in terms of what was going on in the guild, those were some of my predecessors. In terms of the seed for the book, I was invited in, I think it was January of 2011. I could be off by a year, to do a January term combined master's PhD level class intensive for what in those days was Golden Gate Seminary in San Francisco, Today it's called Gateway. It's moved to Southern California. And we talked about a range of possibilities, and we settled on the quest of the historical Jesus. And I thought, okay, now I will have the momentum for something that will be the seeds of a book. Yeah, January of 2011. What is it now? 2024, and the book came out in 2023. So, yeah, a lot of things interrupted it along the way.
Quest for the historical Jesus sounds very exciting. Most of your questing is into a lot of books and documents and writing. Is that correct?
Yes.
Craig is actually Indiana Jones.
If only.
I mean, quest for the historical Jesus, it just makes me think of movie titles and,
That's
and
right.
such.
That's right.
I wish I'd had the physique to traipse along with Indiana Jones or Harrison Ford.
So, what is it then about John that helps fill out our understanding of the historical Jesus? So, if you think of the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's the basic kind of timeline, the chronology, the climax of going to Jerusalem, and so what is it about John particularly that can help fill out the historical portrait that many people have of Jesus?
The most obvious answer to that is not what I tackled in the book. The most obvious answer to that is a very high, lofty, exalted view of who Jesus was, even in human form. I was fascinated by something quite different. A number of people have observed that water features much more commonly in John than elsewhere. And even when water isn't physically present, something often tied to Jesus' teaching about literal or ritual or spiritual cleansing, purification, hence Jesus the Purifier. Mm-hmm. I already had written a much shorter book in the mid-2000s called Contagious Holiness that picked up on what you can find in the Synoptic Gospels, that Jesus has this rather countercultural attitude that it's okay if he cleanses and heals a leper by touching him. He doesn't become unclean. He makes the unclean man clean. It's okay if a woman with a 12-year-long disease of off and on unnatural flow of blood comes up and grabs the hem of his garment, and power goes out from him, and she is healed. We have, in the history of the church, so often been like the Pharisaic wing of Judaism in Jesus' day, where we assumed that corruption is the greater power, and that the life of a godly person is to insulate him or herself from anything that might ever corrupt them, including any person who might ever corrupt them. And therefore, we've not had the impact historically, with some very pleasant exceptions, on the what some might call the riffraff of our society, the way we could have, the way it seems Jesus himself did. But then I turned to John, and right almost in every chapter, John chapter 1 has a whole lot more about the ministry of John the Baptist than any individual synoptic gospel does at the beginning of their gospel. In chapter 2, he is turning water into wine, but John goes out of his way to say it was water that was in 6 large pots used for the Jewish rites of purification. Why bother to tell us that? In John's Gospel, whether you take it as the same episode or a different one, he, quote-unquote, cleanses the temple very early. Nicodemus comes to him, and Jesus says, you must be born of water and the Spirit. And Nicodemus doesn't get it. In chapter 4, he's found with the Samaritan woman at the well, and he uses that to talk about, if you'd ask me, I could give you living water. And she doesn't get it. And the beginning of chapter 5, he is by a pool in Jerusalem, the pool of Bethesda, and he shows a crippled man that he doesn't need to get into the water that he believed he could cure him. That Jesus has a more powerful form of purification. In chapter 6, there is no water where you needed it for 5,000 people that Jesus feeds in the wilderness. No chance under the sun that some of those weren't ritually unclean, and at the very least needed, according to Jewish tradition, ritual hand washing before they ate. Apparently that didn't matter to Jesus. Chapter 7, he's in Jerusalem with the Feast of Tabernacles, and he talks about water flowing out of those who would believe in him. Obviously a metaphor. And you go on and on and on, and you say, what is all this doing here? Is this just something that John made up and added? I don't know. Do we have some special word for hydromaniacs, for people fascinated with water? You can have a pyromaniac, I think, with fire. Or do we have here one of those things that when you analyze historically, you say, all 4 Gospels agree that John the Baptist really did set the stage for whatever Jesus was up to. And whatever John was up to, it had to do with baptism. And baptism was something that was known in Judaism. It was all about ritual cleansing. If you work through John, if we had the time, I think I could trace a progression from more water, focusing on ritual cleansing, to less water and more of a focus on moral cleanliness and purification. Jesus is not overnight, but gradually trying to wean his audiences away from thinking about what will make me ritually unclean. Oh, I touched a dead body, or I had an unusual bodily emission, or I ate unclean food, or in some instances, the really scrupulous folks, I sat at a dinner with people who ate the unclean food, even if I avoided it. No, that's not. And even in the Synoptics, Jesus says it's not what goes in to a person that makes them unclean, but what comes out, including evil thoughts and speech. Maybe John is a not just theological, but also historical window to saying that this theme that you can find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but it never comes out and really hits you on the head, was a bigger thing. It mattered more to the actual living, breathing, historical Jesus, and the church has often recognized. And it's understandable. If you're in a traditional Muslim culture, you know all about ritual impurity. If you're in a modern Western culture, you've never worried once whether you had bacon on your sandwich. And so we don't think about it. Maybe there's something there we ought to think about more. But I'm rambling.
No, that was incredible. What you landed with there, that question, maybe there's something more there that I should think about, that we should think about. And that's what went into the writing of this book. And it makes me wonder, what do all of these depictions, the use of water as a theme, and the way in which purification in its various forms, you said physical, ritual, and then moving into moral.
Yeah.
What should we pay attention to in all that? We being just followers of Jesus here, those of us who are talking today and listening, what is it about this theme that can help us in our knowing of Jesus, in understanding how we're known by Jesus? What should it evoke, I think, in us as we receive love from Jesus and give love? As
I drove around the corner from Broadway and saw some parking places, all of which were full, and so then I made a right angle turn and found some empty parking places, and then walked to the front door. I twice saw a sign that I don't think I've ever seen anything like it on a church anywhere. And I think it's the answer to your question. And that sign said something like, "This is private property. We welcome you to our gallery on several mornings and for Sunday services. If you are in need of shelter, see Urban Peak if you're 20 to 25, and otherwise the Denver Rescue Mission." It struck me as somebody who or maybe a group of somebodies who very thoughtfully said, we've got to protect our property, but we don't want to do so in a way that communicates the wrong message. We want people to know they are welcome here at the times when we can show them that welcome. And if they have other kinds of needs, we want them to know that there are places here in Denver that meet those needs. I don't know what your folks think of it, walking past it every Sunday morning. I suppose eventually you kind of take it for granted. I've lived here 38 years and made a pledge my first year here I would never take the mountains for granted. And I think I've been true to that pledge. It's just amazing. That's what Jesus was about. He was about the least, the last, and the lost. He accepted people where they were. They didn't have to clean up their act in order to be with him and his followers. But if he hung around long enough, he would encourage them in appropriate ways to take steps toward cleaning up their act. That's what I heard, and maybe it's reading my life's mission into one little innocuous sign on your church building. But if you actually are doing what that sign suggests, then I think you've captured Jesus' spirit remarkably well.
I was really drawn in when you were describing water. And
getting thirsty.
And the different ways we think of purity and washing, and I'm thinking of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's a lot of thought and worry around how do I get clean enough, and what really works to really get rid of all my impurities. And everyone's thinking about that. And now what's fascinating living where we live today in our sort of little slice of history, we are still worried about that, not in its physical manifestation as much, but everyone is still very much concerned about being acceptable.
Yep.
Being acceptable and welcomed in some group and being told that you're accepted and you're welcomed, you're pure enough. And how do I get that purity? We don't use that language, but that's really, we still very much live in a purity culture today.
Yep.
Now, as you were talking, I was thinking about the last thing John describes of Jesus on the cross. And I hadn't really thought of it in this framework, but what comes out of the side of Jesus? It's blood and it's water.
Yep.
Maybe unpack for us, or maybe explain, or I'd love to know like your thoughts about John's giving us this beautiful portrait of Jesus, who the final thing that actually comes out of him, that is, it's water and blood.
Yeah.
And what is that? What is John telling us about Jesus in that moment?
You've got sort of two extremes. You've got, helpfully, on the one hand, it's been modern medicine who has enabled us to learn that, and I'm not a doctor, so I hope I say this right, if you pierce the pericardial sac around the heart, within a couple of hours of death, you will get an outflow of blood and a transparent, liquidy type substance that seems to resemble water. So at the purely historical level, this was a way of certifying that Jesus truly died against anyone who might have thought he didn't, which even in the earliest days, there were some who tried to explain the crucifixion and resurrection as, well, he never really died. At the other end of a spectrum where people go into allegory and even fanciful symbolism, it didn't take long in a church that valued baptism and the Lord's Supper as two central rites to say, aha, God was teaching us that the Lord's Supper about his drinking his blood and baptism immersed in water are to be central to the church's faith. At which point, any fair principle of interpretation which says, if you're going to give meaning to a certain event in history, it ought to be something that people at that time could possibly have imagined. Mm-hmm. Anybody watching Jesus, even his followers, the women, John, not the other men, would have said, oh, look at that, water and blood. Oh, let's go have a baptism. No. But the imagery of blood as atoning for sin was at the heart of the Jewish sacrificial system, and Jesus had already talked about that. The imagery of water as purifying was all over the place. If there is a meaning that John saw beyond simply this proved he was really, really dead, I suspect it probably had something to do with, and in ways that we barely begin to fathom, Jesus provided atonement and purification for those who come to him.
Well, Craig, thank you for that. and for giving us a real beautiful description of a way to appreciate and to meditate on Jesus and his life and this aspect of his ministry and his death that I think is really important and can draw us in and to him even more. So thank you for that. Now, for our listeners, if you've been a part of Fellowship Denver, you've experienced some benefit of the ministry of Craig Blomberg in and through the lives of several staff and people in our church. And so in some ways, even if you haven't read a Craig Blomberg book, you've probably heard or been ministered to by something that Craig taught us about at some point in his career. But I do want to, since this is a podcast introducing us to an author, to someone who writes books, I do want to maybe end our discussion with some recommendations about a lot of the things that you have written in the past. And now, obviously, the book that we've talked about, I think, is really powerful, and it's an important book. It is an academic tome that will introduce you, I think, really accessibly. I'm not surprised that it was accessible, Craig, but it's sometimes hard to write something that is accessible and also to be a credible academic work in your guild. That's a
you
difficult...
do it a lot, but it is a talent.
Well, it's hard to do. It is hard, and you're obviously a master at it. But so I would encourage people to read this book, but I would say there is you have to like go into it knowing there's a lot of previous assumed discussions academically that you kind of have to have in order to fully appreciate it. But so get the book. It's great.
And what was it called again?
It's called Jesus the Purifier, John's Gospel and the Fourth Quest for the Historical Jesus.
Oh, that's right. I remember now. Okay.
And it is a Christianity Today Book of the Year. So, I mean, we're not the only ones peddling this book.
You can join Dr. Blomberg on this quest. You can pick up this book and join him on the quest.
You can get a whip and a fancy hat and go on an adventure. But there are other works out there that will introduce people to this genre of research and his history about the New Testament and about Jesus. One is a book that we used as a textbook for one of our forums years ago called Can We Still Believe the Bible? It's a fantastic, accessible work that does talk about, and you address specifically, a lot of the popular level sort of criticisms against the Bible and its historicity and Christianity in general. Some of the new atheists, you kind of address some as well. So I really liked that book. Now, probably even most popularly, though, is Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ. There, for some who have read that book, you may recall there's a chapter about you in that book. And so it's not written by you, but it does his description of you, describing the history behind the New Testament, I think can be a really useful, helpful, and accessible way to kind of introduce people into this kind of research and writing. Interestingly, my son gave the Case to Christ to one of his good friends last week, and he read it.
Cool.
Senior in high school, not a Christian, never been to church except for some random youth things that we've had here at Fellowship, and that's really it. And so it's still, and it's been the like thing they've been able to talk about Ian, my son's faith.
That's great.
So it's still doing its job. So I recommend those two books.
I'm going to repeat them just for our listeners. We'll put the titles to all of these in the notes as well. But the one that you mentioned was Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Christ. And then the other is one of Craig's books, Can We Still Believe the Bible? That's the title of the other book Dave just mentioned.
So, Craig, I would love to know, what do you think? What would you recommend for people as a way to introduce them into this sort of thing?
I would say either of your own books, Dr. Blomberg, or your fellow questers in the area of the historical Jesus. Right. You mentioned, I think, Paul Anderson earlier in our conversation.
Since you brought it up, I don't know if it's still in print, but Amazon usually can deal with that, even if it's not. But there was, for many years, a teen edition of Case for Christ that was maybe a third or a quarter the size of the whole book. And my younger daughter, when she was in middle school, the middle school pastor of the church that we were a part of at that time used it, and she was tickled that her dad got mentioned in it, and disappointed that part of what was abbreviated was the mention of my family, so they didn't include her. But
and
in the
was she disappointed when it came out as a movie that there wasn't a famous actor that played you in the movie?
No, I don't think so. But she was a lot older then, more mature. A book that I think has sold as well as any that I have written on my own is what was designed to be a college-level textbook, and we've even used it with introductory classes at the seminary. And it's just called Jesus and the Gospels, an introduction and survey. But not sure what I did right, but people have told me it's very readable. It's gone through 3 editions, the last of which just came out in 2022. And there is one chapter in it on the whole issue of the historical Jesus that tries to put this straightforward way, succinctly. Paul Anderson has written a number of things, and maybe the place to start for him would be a book that he wrote called The Riddles of the Fourth Gospel. Not more than a couple hundred pages, which by academic standards is comparably short, and is I think it has a subtitle, something like an introduction. I don't know, historical Jesus, something like that. But that would be good. There have been short books. Mark Roberts wrote one on the reliability of the Gospels. A man from Tyndale House, Peter Williams, did one 100-page paperback that looks at these themes. You can find them on Amazon very easily, and then if you prefer to order them from the publisher, you can be led to do that as well. So there's a lot of good stuff out there. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, well, I certainly encourage our listeners to pick up one of these books and to join in the quest.
I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I'm so grateful, Craig, for the time you took to be here with us today. Just one final question. You said you're mostly retired. Sounds like, as we talked before the podcast, you still have plenty going on. But what's one thing, can be anything, something particular to Denver or your family or work that you're doing, but that you're particularly enjoying and looking forward to this fall?
I think I used the word partly, which is quite different than mostly.
Partly, yes, it's true. Good nuance.
I sometimes say that I'm pretty much doing a lot of the same things that I've always done. It's just that people don't pay me anymore, or very little. But I'm actually teaching the one class that I'm teaching at the seminary this fall. is a class in our THM program, but master's level students are welcome to join us as well. Register quickly because we start classes next week, and the deadline to add is the end of next week on the quest of the historical Jesus. So on this very topic, using this book, but reading a bunch of others as well. And then because it's going to be a Zoom live class, meaning in real time, but done by Zoom, I can do it even as I take trips to other places. Had the privilege now in the last 6 years, this will be our third opportunity, my wife and I, to spend a couple of weeks in Brazil. The Portuguese language Christian publishing house, Vida Nova, has been translating my books like Christ We're Coming Back Tomorrow. It's rather remarkable. And the most recent one they have done that will be out is Jesus the Purifier. And so we're doing a book launch in 3 different locations and various speaking opportunities that are related to that. And so very much looking forward to that in September.
The sort of honeymoons that you are prone to take continue.
That's right. That's right.
Well, Dave, Craig, thank you so much for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast today. To those of you listening, if you have questions about today's episode or suggestions that you'd like to hear us discuss on the podcast in the future, send all of that anytime to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.